On the morning of my 25th birthday, I didn't wake up to candles or a card. I woke up to my father knocking on the guest house door, with my suitcase already packed. No explanation, no plan, just a cold goodbye from the people who raised me. But as I stood alone in a motel hours later, I unzipped that suitcase and found an envelope my grandfather had hidden years before. They had erased me, but he hadn't. And what he left behind changed everything. This is the story of what happens when someone tries to push you out of your own life. And the one person who made sure you'd still have a place in it. Let me tell you what he gave me, and why they'll never be able to take it. I turned 25 on a Monday. No celebration, no candles, no cake. Just the sound of my father's knuckles rapping on the guest house door at exactly 7:02 a.m. I was still in my robe, half awake, the kind of groggy that lingers after you've stayed up too late thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. Outside the window, Oregon's fog still clung to the trees. A gray morning, quiet and damp, like the world itself had hit snooze. Marina, my father's voice called through the door. Come to the main house. We need to talk. Those 5 words, we need to talk, have never announced anything good. I pulled on a hoodie, slipped into my worn-out slippers, and opened the door. There he was. Gregory Elwood in pressed khakis and a Patagonia fleece, looking like he was about to prune roses, not upend someone's morning. His expression was unreadable. Not cold, not warm, just efficient. I followed him through the back gate and across the damp stone path to the main house, passing under the same climbing ivy that had grown along the trellis since I was a child. The house was still. The smell of fresh coffee floated through the air, cinnamon toast and citrus cleaner. Sylvia, my mother, was already seated at the kitchen table, fully dressed hair pulled back, lipstick on. She didn't look up from her mug when I walked in. She simply glanced at my hoodie, then at her watch. There were no balloons, no happy birthday, sweetie, no card. But there was a suitcase. My suitcase. The old leather one with the initials M.E. etched into the side, the one I hadn't touched since college. It sat by the front door, zipped tight. Neat. Intentional. Final. I stood there taking it in, unsure if this was a mistake. Maybe someone was heading out of town. Maybe it wasn't mine. Maybe this wasn't what it looked like. But then my father turned to face me. You're 25 now, he said. It's time. I blinked. Time for what? He cleared his throat the way he always did before giving advice that wasn't really a conversation. We've decided it's time for you to move out of the guest house. Derek's business is gaining momentum and he needs a quiet place to focus. He'll be moving in tomorrow. I looked at my mother. She didn't even flinch. Just lifted her mug to her lips like this was as routine as watering the plants. Today I asked the word catching in my throat. Yes, my father said. We've packed your essentials to save you time. We've packed your essentials. Like this was a helpful gesture. I wanted to ask them where they expected me to go. I wanted to ask how long they'd been planning this. I wanted to ask why they couldn't have waited one more day. But I didn't. Instead, I walked to the suitcase, touched the worn leather, and quietly asked, That's it. My mother finally looked at me. You've had a good run here, but it's time for you to start your own life. You're an adult now, Marina. As if I hadn't been one since 18, when I juggled scholarships, waitressing night shifts, and built my first design portfolio from YouTube tutorials and free Canva templates. As if I hadn't been the one fixing their printer, helping with their taxes, and covering last-minute errands whenever Derek didn't show up. But this wasn't about gratitude. This was about space. And Derek needed it. They didn't ask where I'd go. They didn't offer a ride, or even a list of nearby sublets. They just stood there, 2 professionals handing off a transition plan. I picked up the suitcase. My father opened the front door like a chauffeur. The morning air was crisp and scentless. My slippers slid slightly on the dew-wet stones. I didn't look back. I didn't cry either. Not when I stepped outside. Not when the gate clicked shut behind me. Not when I heard the door close and lock like punctuation at the end of a sentence I didn't write. I just kept walking. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there, not even in spirit. Not even as a shadow on their porch. They hadn't yelled. They hadn't blamed. They hadn't even looked angry. That's what made it worse. The worst part wasn't being asked to leave. It wasn't even the absence of celebration on my birthday. It was the quiet way they decided I didn't belong, and how normal they made it look. As if my departure was just a line item on the day's to-do list. As if I was a guest overstaying a reservation in a life that was supposed to be my own. And somehow they'd convinced themselves it was the reasonable thing to do. That made it sting more than any fight ever could. They never said I was the favorite. But they didn't have to. It was there. In the way they spoke about Derek, my younger brother. The way they hovered around his every whim, celebrated every small milestone as if it were a national holiday. When he got into Westbridge University, a private liberal arts school on the East Coast, they framed the acceptance letter and hung it in the foyer. When I got into Lane Community College, no one said anything. There was no congratulatory dinner. Just a mention from my mother. Well, at least it's nearby and the tuition won't bury us. So I buried myself in work instead. I took on a full course load, waited tables in the evenings, and picked up freelance design gigs where I could flyers for local businesses, website templates for Etsy sellers, a banner ad for a vape shop I hoped no one from school would ever see. I didn't complain, didn't ask for help, didn't want to be a burden. That was always the unspoken rule with me. Marina will figure it out. And I did. Quietly. Consistently. Predictably. There's a kind of identity that forms when you're the one everyone assumes will survive. Not thrive. Just survive. That was me. The reliable one. The steady heartbeat in the background. When Derek forgot to submit a housing deposit his sophomore year, I helped him find a sublet. When his car battery died midwinter, I drove across town with jumper cables and hot coffee. When he pivoted from economics to a startup vision his junior year, my parents threw a backyard launch party with custom banners and a catered taco bar. They called it his first big step into adulthood. I designed his pitch deck. I didn't charge. He didn't thank me. I still remember the night I finished my final capstone project, a conceptual redesign of a downtown public library. It had taken me 2 weeks staying after hours every day working with stubborn rendering software and printers that ran out of ink at the worst times. My professors loved it. One even suggested submitting it to a student architecture competition. I invited my parents to the small exhibit at the student center. My mom said she had a dental cleaning. My dad said he'd try depending on traffic. They didn't come. Instead, that night I got a text from Sylvia with a photo of Derek holding a new pair of noise-canceling headphones. "Look what we got him for focus time," she wrote, as if I was expected to be excited on his behalf. I remember staring at the screen, still holding the corner of my foam board project, waiting for some part of me to feel angry. But I didn't feel anger. I felt small, and worse, accustomed to it. It wasn't new. There had always been a pattern, subtle but steady, like background music you don't notice until it stops. One Thanksgiving when I was 16, Derek knocked over a candle and nearly set the tablecloth on fire. I put it out with a glass of water. Everyone laughed about Derek the tornado. Later that night, I cleared the dishes, scrubbed cranberry sauce off the counters, and fell asleep doing extra credit for a graphic design class. No one said thank you. But they always said I was so dependable. That word used to make me proud. Now it just made me feel like a utility. Something useful but replaceable. The only person who ever seemed to see beyond that was my grandfather. Henry Victor Elwood. He was a structural engineer by trade, an artist at heart. When I was little, he'd let me sit beside him at his drafting desk, a massive oak thing that smelled like pencil lead and old leather. He never talked down to me, never asked me to go play elsewhere. Instead, he'd hand me a blank sheet of vellum and say, "Let's see what your hands know that your words haven't caught up to yet." I didn't always understand what he meant, but I drew anyway. Stairs that went nowhere, towers with open ceilings, gardens on rooftops. One afternoon, he tapped one of my sketches and said, "You notice things others skip. That's not noise, Marina. That's your lens. Protect it." It was the only time I remember feeling seen without having to perform. After he passed, things changed. Not overnight, but steadily. The drafting desk was moved to the garage. The house got quieter. And I got more efficient, because being emotional didn't fit the role I'd been assigned. Reliable, quiet, unobtrusive. That's the word my mother used once. Unobtrusive. When someone asked about me at a family brunch, I remember it vividly. She was wearing her pearl earrings. There was mimosas on the table, and she smiled like it was a compliment. She's always been so unobtrusive, a very grounded young woman. I excused myself to the kitchen and stayed there for the rest of the meal. It's not that I was invisible, it's that they had learned to look right through me, and I had learned not to make them uncomfortable by asking them to look harder. The room smelled like lemon cleaner trying to mask something older, something mildew-stained and never quite scrubbed out. The wallpaper curled slightly near the ceiling, and the light flickered once before settling into a dim, sickly hum. I dropped the suitcase onto the thin carpet and sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the handle like I wasn't sure I was allowed to let go yet. I hadn't said a word since I left the house. The silence had followed me like a second shadow, pressing into every corner of this tiny, forgotten motel just outside of Eugene. There was a vending machine buzzing behind the far wall, and every now and then a truck passed outside, headlights flashing against the closed blinds. I opened the suitcase, not because I needed anything in it, but because I needed to feel like I had something to do. The contents were as promised: my essentials, a toothbrush still in its plastic cup, folded jeans, 3 pairs of socks, one charger, my sketchbook, and a weathered gray hoodie. Everything had been packed too neatly, too thoughtfully. That was the part that made my stomach twist. It wasn't a rushed decision. It had been planned. I moved aside the top layer of clothes and unzipped the inside flap. That's when I saw it. A pale yellow envelope tucked flat against the lining, so thin and precisely placed that it would have gone unnoticed unless I was looking for something to find. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Sharp. Clean. Intentional. Marina. In all capital letters drawn in the precise script of someone who spent a lifetime drafting blueprints. It was my grandfather's. Suddenly I was 17 again, sitting beside his enormous drafting table, tracing the edge of a T-square, while he explained why real architects used pencil first. Because real structure, he once told me, doesn't start with decoration, it starts with clarity. My hands shook slightly as I lifted the envelope. I had forgotten. No, that wasn't right. I had tucked this letter into my old suitcase 10 years ago after his funeral, just as he instructed. Not until you're 25, he had said, pressing it into my hands with that steady gaze of his. You'll know when it's time. But that day had felt impossibly far away. So I stored it away for safekeeping and let time blur the edges. Apparently that time was now. I didn't open it right away. Not in that moment, not in that room. Part of me didn't want his voice to echo in a place that smelled like loss and burnt coffee. But the part of me that had just been erased without a second thought needed to know. Had anyone ever seen me clearly? I slid my finger under the flap and peeled it open. Inside were 3 items. The first, a letter 2 pages long, typed on linen paper, signed in blue ink. Dear Marina, if you're reading this, you've turned 25. And that means the terms we discussed are now yours to claim. He went on to recount how he'd built Elwood & Sons from a single contractor's license and a rented truck, how he poured himself into every corner of the company. Not just for success, but for structure, for permanence, for family. Your father has ambition, he wrote, but ambition is not the same as vision. And vision, that's what you've always had. He described how he watched me as a child, how I studied shapes in silence, how I rearranged furniture when no one was looking, how I noticed what others didn't bother to name. You're not loud, Marina. You're precise. That kind of mind doesn't seek attention, it creates focus. He said he'd always believed in the value of quiet clarity, and so he left me something to protect it. The second item in the envelope was a notarized legal document. I recognized the letterhead, Ballard, Hart & Keene, the law firm he trusted. It was a transfer of interest confirming that 15% of Elwood & Sons had been placed in my name, effective on my 25th birthday. No one can revoke it, he had written in the margin. They can delay, they can ignore, but the ownership is yours. And if you choose to use it, your voice at the table is too. I stared at the number. 15%. Not in abstract terms. Not in, you'll have influence someday platitudes. This was legal. Final. Real. The third item was a small business card. Adrian Ballard Estate Counsel, Elwood and Sons Affairs. A phone number printed in minimalist font and beneath it in my grandfather's own handwriting. If they never told you, call her. That single line hit me harder than the rest. If they never told you, he knew. He had known all along that there was a chance my parents would keep it from me. And they had. 10 years. 10 whole years I had been designing logos for local bakeries and scraping together rent while a portion of the company bearing our name legally belonged to me. No one said a word. I looked up at the ceiling. The light buzzed. The vending machine rumbled to life. And I just sat there, letter in hand, feeling a silence deeper than before. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence of being remembered in secret. I looked back down at the envelope, the ink now slightly smudged from the pressure of my thumb. And then the words formed in my mind, with a clarity sharper than anger. They erased me. He ensured I'd never be forgotten. I called the number on the card the next morning just after sunrise. The motel coffee was weak, the paper cup already beginning to sag in my hand, and I still hadn't fully slept. But something inside me, something steady and wordless, told me it was time to take the next step. The phone rang twice before a calm voice answered. Ballard and Associates. This is Dana. I cleared my throat. Hi, I'm looking to speak with Adrian Ballard. My name is Marina Elwood. There was a pause, like someone flipping through a file in real time, then quieter. One moment, please. A brief click. Then another voice, warm and measured. Ms. Elwood, Adrian said, like she had been waiting for the call. Her voice had the tone of someone who had done this many times, unwrapping legacies left behind by people who knew how to plan for silence. I liked her instantly. I have the envelope, I said. The original documents. My grandfather left them for me. Good, she replied almost softly. Do you have somewhere you can come in today? I'd prefer to go over this in person. A few hours later, I stood in her office in downtown Portland, one of those glass and brick buildings wedged between a florist and a notary public. Unassuming from the outside, but inside it smelled like lavender oil and clean decisions. Adrienne looked to be in her late 50s, silver-streaked hair tied back neatly, no wedding band, soft leather shoes. Her bookshelf was filled with legal volumes, one shelf dedicated entirely to architecture and design. That detail made my chest tighten. Like my grandfather had chosen someone who would speak my language without asking me to translate. We didn't shake hands. She just nodded, motioned for me to sit, and asked for the envelope. I handed it over. She read through each page silently, eyes sharp but kind. These are the originals, she confirmed. Then she opened a drawer, retrieved a slim folder, and began to speak, clearly without condescension. You own 15% of Elwood and Sons, she said. Effective as of your 25th birthday. No one can contest it. The structure your grandfather put in place is robust. I blinked. And what does that mean? What comes with it? A lot, she said simply. She explained voting rights, access to financial records, quarterly dividend payments, attendance at board meetings. She told me what I could ask for, what I could question, what I could decline. I barely spoke. I just listened. For years I had accepted invisibility as my role. But here with this woman I had never met, I wasn't invisible. I was someone with presence, someone legally required to be included. By the time we finished, she handed me a clean leather-bound folder embossed with the firm's logo. Start here, she said. There's more to come, but this is the foundation. That word, foundation, stayed with me all the way back to the motel. I didn't go inside. I just sat in the parking lot, folder on the passenger seat, hands still trembling from the weight of it. Later that afternoon, I took a bus to the east side of Portland. I'd remembered seeing a for-lease sign in a building near the river, a second-floor unit above a used bookstore with big windows and terrible paint. I called the number. By evening, the landlord met me there with a key and a shrug. "It's rough," he said, unlocking the door. It was. The floors creaked. The light switch sparked slightly. The walls were a dusty beige no one had painted over in years. But it had potential. A lot of it. The next day, I signed a 6-month lease and paid the deposit with the first dividend check from Elwood and Sons. That same week, I bought a desk. Simple white oak, the kind with clean lines and no drawers. A second-hand sofa with deep navy fabric. A standing lamp that looked like a tree branch. I sanded and repainted the walls myself, bright white on 3 sides, deep olive on the 4th. I hung 3 of my favorite prints. One of them was a sketch I had done at 17. A rooftop garden drawn in soft graphite, almost forgotten in a folder under my bed. I bought a small brass plaque and had it engraved at a key shop a few blocks away. When it was ready, I screwed it into the wood just outside the door. Marina Elwood design. Built in silence. I didn't post about it. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't even text a friend. I just stood in front of it for a long time, my hand resting on the doorknob. There were no balloons. No applause. No one to pat me on the back. But there was something else. For the first time in my life, I was entering a space that belonged entirely to me. Not borrowed, not temporary, not approved by someone else. Just mine. I didn't call my parents. I didn't send an update. I didn't announce anything. There's a power in starting quietly, in building without broadcasting. I wasn't doing this to prove anyone wrong. I was doing it to finally build something that felt right, on my terms in my name, and without anyone telling me where I didn't belong. It started with a woman named Ellen Price, one of my mother's oldest friends from college. The kind of person who sends holiday cards with family photos staged like catalog shoots and never forgets a birthday, even if she hasn't seen you in years. She wasn't someone I'd thought about in a long time until she became the accidental messenger of my existence. Ellen was having her usual Tuesday morning coffee while scrolling through Northwest Architect Digest on her tablet. She liked to keep up appearances even in retirement. That's when she saw it. My name. Second column halfway down the page. Top 30, under 30. Emerging voices in interior architecture. Among this year's standouts is Marina Elwood, whose work in adaptive reuse and minimalist space transformation has quietly reshaped Portland's creative districts. Her studio, self-founded, self-financed, and self-directed, has attracted clients from wellness centers to tech incubators. Just 3 paragraphs. No photo. No clickbait headline. But it was enough. Ellen called my mother immediately. Sylvia did. You know Marina's made some kind of list? Something about design and top architects under 30. I imagine the pause on the other end. My mother probably blinked, then covered the receiver to control her reaction. Oh, really? No, I hadn't seen that. We've, given her some space lately. But of course that space was never neutral. It was punishment disguised as distance. By the end of that day, the article had made its way through the extended Elwood grapevine. Aunt Meredith forwarded it to my father. My cousin in Seattle tagged me in a congratulatory post I never acknowledged. Someone even tried to connect with my studio's account via Instagram, using the caption, "Elwoods really do build things." That part stung a little. Back in Eugene, the timing couldn't have been worse. For them. Derek, my younger brother, had just bombed a 3rd round of investor pitches. The startup he'd been promising for over 2 years still didn't have a working prototype. His developer ghosted him. The seed money was drying up. The brand identity he'd bragged about on Thanksgiving. It didn't even have a website. More importantly, the soft verbal commitment from an angel investor. His supposed breakthrough evaporated over the weekend after a due diligence call went poorly. What I didn't know yet, but would soon learn, was that in an effort to keep Derek's venture afloat, my father had leveraged assets from Elwood and Sons as collateral without board approval, without my knowledge, without even a warning. Maybe he assumed no one would notice. Maybe he thought my 15% ownership was symbolic. Or maybe, like always, he assumed I wouldn't get in the way. But the banks had noticed. So had the auditors. And now calls were being made. I was in the studio when my phone rang. The number blinked once on my screen, Gregory Elwood. It took me a second to remember the last time he had called me directly. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello? There was a familiar, clear throat pause. The one he used before delivering news he didn't want to explain. Marina, he said. His voice was carefully measured. We need to talk. No, how are you? No congratulations. Not even a mention of the article. Just a directive. Like a summons. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch just long enough to notice he was uncomfortable. Is this about Elwood and Sons? I asked calmly. A pause again. There's a situation, he admitted. I'd like to go over some things. In person, if possible. His tone was firm, but behind it I heard something I'd never heard in my father's voice before. Not exactly panic, but recognition. Of a shift. Of a new reality. Let me check my schedule, I said. I'm in the middle of 2 client deadlines this week. I'll get back to you. I could almost feel the muscles in his jaw tighten through the phone. All right, he said quietly. Please do. And then the call ended. No, take care. No, we miss you. No acknowledgement of the irony that he was now coming to me. I stared at the wall for a while afterward. The late afternoon light was pooling on the floor near my sketchbook. My hands were still marked with graphite. I had once built decks and diagrams and brand concepts for Derek for free, out of duty, out of some desperate hope that helping him would eventually mean I'd be noticed too. But now they were calling me not because I was available, but because I mattered. They used to say I was the grounded one, the stable daughter, the one they never had to worry about. But what they really meant was, she won't rock the boat. She won't need attention. She won't challenge us. Now I was the current they hadn't accounted for. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. I was something far quieter, and far more dangerous to people who rely on silence to stay in control. I was aware. And for the first time, they were too. The girl they once ignored was now the woman with voting rights, access to company records, and a design studio that was gaining traction in a city that no longer needed their approval to recognize her value. They had built their world assuming I would stay in the corner. But I had found the door. And quietly, without asking, I walked through it. The conference room inside Ballard and Associates was quiet. Too quiet. The walls were lined with matte charcoal paneling and soft spotlights meant to ease the pressure of hard conversations. There was a glass carafe of water at the center of the table untouched. Across from me sat Sylvia and Gregory Elwood, dressed in the polished tension of people trying to appear composed. It was the first time I'd seen them in person since they packed my suitcase. Adrian sat to my left, flipping through a folder with the ease of someone who had already anticipated every word that might be said. She gave me a brief nod when we entered the room but didn't hover. She knew I needed this to be mine. I'd suggested the meeting take place here. For formality, yes, but also for clarity. I wanted them in a space where I was not their daughter. I was a shareholder. A voice they could no longer mute. Sylvia cleared her throat first. Marina. She began with a half-smile that looked rehearsed. Thank you for meeting us. We know this isn't easy. I didn't say anything. I wasn't going to make it easier. She continued. We're in a difficult moment right now. The company is facing liquidity issues. There's been some miscommunication internally, and unfortunately some actions were taken without full alignment from the board. A glance at Gregory. He adjusted his tie but said nothing. I'm sure you've heard about the situation with Derek's venture. We were hoping for a partnership that didn't materialize, and there were some crossovers with company collateral. Things have gotten more complicated than expected. She paused, then folded her hands. We're asking for your support, not just as a daughter, but as someone who cares about the future of this family and this company. There it was. That word, family. So clean, so soft on the tongue. So easy to say when you need something. I leaned forward, keeping my voice even. Is this, I asked slowly, the same family that told me to leave on the morning of my 25th birthday? Sylvia blinked. Gregory sat up straighter. I just want to be clear, I added. You're asking me to help save a company you didn't think I belonged to. A company I've had a legal stake in for 10 years. One no one told me about until I unpacked a suitcase in a motel room. And now you're here, not because I'm family, but because I'm useful. Again. I looked directly at Sylvia. Did you pack that envelope into my bag, or did you just not check what was inside before you zipped it up? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Gregory finally spoke. Marina, we've all made mistakes. The way things played out. Yes, it was imperfect. But this isn't the time to dwell on that. We need to come together. Come together, I repeated as if the words were foreign. He pressed on. You have resources now. Influence. And we know you've always been level-headed. You're not the kind of person to let things collapse out of pride. That last word hung in the air like a challenge. I felt my pulse slow instead of quicken. Because I'd expected this. Not anger. Not remorse. But repositioning. They weren't here to reconcile. They were here to negotiate. Adrian shifted slightly beside me but didn't interrupt. I took a long breath and looked at the table. Not at them. Not anymore. I will do what's necessary to protect my share of Elwood and Sons, I said clearly. I'll attend the board meeting. I'll review the documents and consult with counsel. Gregory nodded, relief beginning to show. But I added, I'm not doing it for you. They both looked up. I'm not doing this because we're family. I'm not doing it because I forgive you. And I'm certainly not doing it out of some desire to fix what's broken between us. Sylvia opened her mouth again, this time a little more urgently. Marina, we never meant for it to feel like… You didn't think about how it would feel, I said calmly, cutting her off without raising my voice. That's the point. You didn't see me when I was right in front of you for years. You didn't come to my shows. You didn't ask about my work. You made space for Derek to dream and you asked me to stay quiet. I looked at them both without blinking. And when I turned 25, on the morning of my birthday, you asked me to leave. No warning, no plan, no goodbye. You zipped up my suitcase and opened the door. Silence again. No apology, no ownership, just the faint sound of the HVAC humming overhead like a breath that never finishes. I stood slowly smoothing my palms on the front of my trousers. I'll do what's right for the company, because it's partly mine. Because people work there who depend on it. And because I care about the work my grandfather built. My gaze sharpened slightly. But don't mistake that for loyalty to people who only see me when things fall apart. I turned to Adrienne. You'll keep me updated on the audit findings. Of course, she said, already rising to gather the documents. I didn't look back as I walked to the door. There were no slammed fists, no shouted accusations, just the soft scrape of a chair as one of them shifted behind me, too late to change anything. Outside the building, the air felt cooler than before. I buttoned my coat and walked slowly to the corner, letting the rhythm of my steps remind me that I wasn't the same girl they had let go. This time I wasn't walking away in silence. This time I was leaving with authority, and I was doing it without needing their permission. The next board meeting at Elwood & Sons was not explosive. There were no raised voices, no dramatic walkouts, no breaking news. Just a conference room filled with polite tension, carefully measured words, and several people suddenly realizing that I wasn't just someone they could politely ignore anymore. The moment I walked in, heads turned, not with surprise but with caution. I had been CC'd on every internal document for the past 2 weeks. My lawyer had reviewed the company's governance structure. I had legal standing, yes, but more importantly, I had preparation. Gregory was present, seated 3 chairs from the head of the table. Sylvia wasn't there. Whether by strategy or shame, I didn't know. And I didn't ask. I took my place opposite the CEO, a longtime colleague of my grandfather's who'd quietly stayed on after the transition of leadership. His eyes met mine with something that felt close to respect. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I'd like to formally propose a restructuring of the Executive Advisory Board, I said. My voice was steady like I had practiced, but I hadn't. This had been coming for years. I was simply giving it shape. I presented a list of names, experienced professionals from design, logistics, finance. People with proven track records, none of them Elwood by blood. Then I passed out a second page, data, performance reviews, feedback from key staff. I didn't mention Gregory's name. I didn't have to. The numbers spoke louder than anything I could say. Some board members exchanged glances. A few nodded. One leaned forward and said, "We've needed new direction for a while. This is a solid starting point." Gregory shifted in his seat, his hands clasped tightly together, but he didn't interrupt. Maybe he understood that objecting would only underscore how little control he still held. Maybe he finally realized this wasn't just a phase of mine. After the vote to initiate the restructuring process passed, 6-1 with one abstaining, I leaned back in my chair calm and composed. No gloating, no satisfaction, just the quiet understanding that power isn't always taken with force. Sometimes it's reclaimed in silence. I didn't stay for the small talk afterward. As I left the room, Gregory stood as if he might follow me. But he didn't. He just stood there, still gripping his pen like it could anchor him to a version of the company that no longer existed. Later that day, I returned to my studio. It was early evening, the kind of light that's soft enough to make a room feel warmer without a single bulb turned on. My desk was covered with fabric swatches and clay renderings from a new wellness center contract, my biggest client yet. But for the first time all week, I didn't feel the pressure to get back to work immediately. I walked to the door, stepped outside into the hallway, and looked at the sign again. Marina Elwood. Design. Built in silence. I stared at it for a while. Not because I doubted it, but because it had taken on a new meaning now. Before that sign was a declaration to myself, a reminder that what I built was mine and mine alone, that I didn't need their recognition to matter. Now it felt like something else, not a banner of independence, but a foundation stone. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the sign. Just one. Simple. Framed neatly, with no filter. Then I opened my messages and found Gregory's contact. There was no conversation thread, just his name. I attached the photo, typed nothing, and hit send. No explanation, no caption, just the image of the door he never thought I'd walk through, let alone own. I locked the studio and walked down the street toward the cafe on the corner. I didn't check to see if he replied. I didn't wait for the 3 dots to appear. Because this wasn't a message that needed a response. This wasn't about burning bridges or throwing blame. This was a timestamp, a quiet marker that I had arrived where they never thought I'd go, without their help and without needing their validation. I had not destroyed anything. I had not stormed the gates. I had simply taken back what had always been mine and built on it. There's something strangely liberating about reclaiming your voice without needing to raise it. In the weeks that followed, I kept showing up to board meetings. I contributed. I voted. I reviewed budgets. I made decisions. Not for revenge, but for responsibility. And at the end of every day, I returned to my studio, turned the key in the lock, and stepped into a space that was both mine and bigger than me. A space not carved out by family legacy, but redefined by choice. I wasn't there to prove I was worthy. I was there because I had always been worth listening to. They just finally ran out of ways to ignore that. It was a crisp morning in late October when my phone rang. The kind of morning where the air smells faintly of cinnamon and turning leaves, where sunlight filters through the blinds like soft gold. I had just finished boiling water for tea when I saw the name flash on my screen. Mom. I didn't answer right away. I let it ring 3 times, watching the steam curl above the mug, letting the sound settle into the room like something distant. Then I picked up. Her voice was thin, barely more than a whisper, but not the cold kind I had grown used to. This one trembled. Marina. A pause. I was wrong, she said. I don't know how else to say it. But I was. About everything. I stayed quiet. I don't know where to begin, she continued, or what to say that won't sound like excuses. But I think about that morning, every day. The door, the suitcase, your face. I don't know why I. Her voice broke just slightly. I was wrong. For a long moment I didn't speak. I looked around the studio, the soft rug beneath my feet, the shelves filled with samples and sketches, the sunlight reaching gently across the floor like it knew it belonged there. And then I said, "You don't have to begin. Just let me finish." She didn't reply, but she didn't hang up either. I could hear her breathing quiet and uncertain on the other end. And then slowly, she exhaled, like she had been holding something in for years. I understand, she said. It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. I set the phone down on the counter without saying goodbye. Not out of anger, just out of clarity. Some conversations don't need a closing line. Some just end where they need to. I walked to the studio door and unlocked it. The air that greeted me was cool and dry, tinged with early sunlight and the distant scent of a bakery 2 buildings down. I stepped outside for a moment, letting the warmth of the light land on my skin, my breath fogging just slightly as I looked out over the quiet street. It was just another morning, but it felt like a beginning. Not the dramatic kind, not the starting over kind, just a quiet shift. A moment where I knew I didn't need anything from anyone to move forward. I didn't need permission, or applause, or redemption. I had already chosen my ending. And more importantly, I had chosen what came after. In the months since the board restructuring the studio had started to grow, not fast, not flashy, but steadily. A local nonprofit reached out about redesigning a women's shelter. A small publishing house asked for help modernizing their space. One client even told me, "Your work doesn't scream. It listens." That stayed with me, because for so long I thought I had to be louder to be heard. But maybe all along I just needed to speak in my own volume and wait until I found the right room. And I had, finally. My worth wasn't something I needed others to confirm anymore. It wasn't tied to the roles they gave me or the space they let me occupy. It lived here, in the way I stood, in the way I worked, in the way I walked through the world without shrinking. For years, I believed that if I just proved myself, if I was quiet enough, useful enough, humble enough, they would eventually turn around and say, "We see you." But the truth was, I had always been visible. They just hadn't been looking. And now I had stopped waiting for them to turn around. Now I walked in a different direction. That morning after the call, I sat at my desk with a blank sheet of tracing paper and let my pencil move the way it always had, without overthinking, without apology. Lines formed, angles, light studies, texture cues, a new project, a new space, a new story. But this time I wasn't building for recognition. I wasn't designing something to be seen. I was designing something to feel right, something that held. And as the light filled the studio and the city woke around me, I understood something I hadn't been able to name before. I didn't need a happy ending. I just needed a true one. And this was mine. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Like your quiet efforts were overlooked, while others were celebrated for just showing up? Marina's story isn't just about legacy or legal rights. It's about reclaiming the parts of ourselves that others tried to write off. It's about choosing peace over performance, and finally being heard even in silence. If her journey resonated with you, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear. What would you say to your past self if you could go back to the moment you were pushed aside? And if you want to hear more stories like this, raw, real, and quietly powerful, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Because sometimes the stories that echo the longest are the ones told in silence.